Welcome to part 2 of the Warrior series. Now, I wasn't planning to spend more than a few minutes on this topic at first, but this one principle that we are going to cover in this video is so important that I'm going to dedicate an entire video to it. See, I've had to personally do a lot of work on this subject, and if I may be vulnerable for a moment and share with you a little bit about my upbringing, I grew up with a lot of insecurities. And these included the beliefs that I'm not good enough, that I'm not smart enough, capable enough, fit enough, good looking enough, capable enough. See, growing up, my intelligence was constantly questioned. I heard the words, you are stupid, or you are dumb, or you've got a pig nose far more times than I heard the words, you can do this, or I'm proud of you, or you're beautiful, just the way that you are. I remember in high school, I watched the movie American Beauty, and in it, one of the characters said, in order to be successful, one must project an image of success at all times. And I took that advice to my teenager heart. I put on a mask and layer of armor that was so thick that I could paint anything I wanted to on this canvas to protect my vulnerable self. And I spent most of my money on designer clothes. I pursued things that made me look great on the outside, made me look good on paper. My sense of worth was measured in the people that I spent time with, the number of digits in my bank account, the number of awards tied to my name, the job titles I accumulated, or things I achieved. I became my titles and my achievements. Now, I'm not saying that was good advice because I would have to spend many years unlearning this, because soon I realized that what I had developed wasn't real confidence. It was feigned confidence. It wasn't real security. It was masked insecurity. Inside, I felt no different than the wounded kid that made a decision to adapt a flawed motto based on a movie. Later, I would go on to learn a lesson that many will go their entire lives without fully learning. That an identity that is propped up by fancy titles, material accumulations, or even a family name is a misplaced sense of value and self-worth. If anything, we can call it out for its real name: pride. And there is no fulfillment or lasting progress that comes with pride. If anything, pride is a house of cards that is waiting to collapse. If you are a leader or an aspiring leader who wants to make an authentic, positive, and sustainable impact on the world, you need to watch this video. If you want to rise to the highest levels of service and leadership, you need to watch this video. Because in this video, I will share a foundational principle on how to rise from the position that you're at right now to one where your service, impact, and position is elevated, strengthened, and amplified, while remaining true to your highest sense of self. Right now, we're living in an age where we measure our value, impact, and progress that's based on the number of likes or followers that we have, the number of digits in our bank account, our job title, the names we mingle with, the events we attend, or even the family name we were born into. But here's the problem with that. When our value or identity is founded in these categories, it leads to a false sense of self. We forget our service and we focus more on this propped up sense of this identity we would like to present into the world. Like a hungry ghost, to borrow a Buddhist terminology, this false sense of self can only be satisfied by the accumulation of more and more of these things. There is a word where one derives one's sense of self-worth or identity from their achievements, affiliations, or possessions. That word is pride. And according to the wise King Solomon's Proverbs, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And when a warrior or leader contains pride in his or her heart, it leads to self-serving behaviors, the chasing of false criteria that are at odds with what life wants to reveal more of through us, the spirit of service and the demonstration of unconditional love. So if pride goes before a fall, then what elevates us? According to St. Augustine, it is the virtue that gives rise to all other virtues. And this is principle 5 in part 2 of the Warrior series. Pride leads to downfall, while humility reveals our absolute potential. Imagine this scene as Jesus and his disciples walk towards Jerusalem. Jesus has just shared with his disciples that he is going to be killed in his mission, but that he will rise again. His young disciples don't really comprehend the meaning of what Jesus is saying, because according to Jewish tradition, the Messiah would be the mighty savior of Israel, who comes in like a conquering warrior king, as one would expect of someone from King David's line. Such a warrior king cannot die. He would defeat the Romans and overthrow the tyrannical establishment, establishing a reign of peace and glory. Believing that Jesus' rule would be an earthly rule with an earthly power structure, his disciples James and John asked Jesus if they could be seated closest to him once his throne is established. See, his disciples have completely misunderstood the nature of Jesus' mission. They wrongly assume, just as many of us would today, power and prestige is closely connected to the traditional power structure, proximity to the seat of power. Jesus takes the opportunity here to share a lesson on what it means to be a true leader, one that every leader or aspiring leader should pay very close attention to. The rulers of the Gentiles have great power. Their important officials give many orders to people. You must not behave like that, he advised his disciples. He then offered an elevated perspective of how a leader ought to show up. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be slave to all. And then referring to himself, he says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." But a true leader is not the one who attains his or her position by name, title, rank, hierarchy, or heredity. These titles are meaningless unless they demonstrate foremost a desire to serve, just like a warrior who earns his or her badges in the line of duty for selfless service. There was another instance in the book of Matthew where Jesus doubles down on this theme. He warns his disciples, do not behave like those in transactional or nominal positions of power. Everything they do is for people to see. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. Instead, Jesus advises his disciples to lead as dutiful shepherds under the banner of service and humility. The greatest among you, he says, will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. A true leader's position is earned through humble service. During my horse archery training, all the participants showed up to the beach ready to get our hands on some bows and arrows and start galloping on some horses. Yet the very first practice of our warrior training was for us to pick up trash that had washed along the beach from the ocean. Now, this seemed like a pretty unglamorous start, but there is a great lesson here. The true warrior or leader takes great care of others and their environment, their community, their country, the world as their priority. They live for service. They act with great purpose. They value worthy causes above their own life. The worthier the cause, the louder their names echo through the halls of power and history. While preparing for this talk, I looked up the Oxford Dictionary's definition of humility, and to be honest with you, it doesn't give a very inspiring description to live up to. So sorry, Oxford Dictionary, but where exactly is the value in this? This definition also misses the point that as your soul is the reflection of God, you are important. You are supremely important. You're just not unique in your importance, because so is everybody else, whether they realize it or not. The Oxford Dictionary definition of humility is not what I'm referring to when I speak of humility, because the spiritual definition of humility is not so much focused on the self-negation part, but the part that is full of grand possibility. Here's what I understand that it takes in order to be spiritually humble. 1, it requires great trust. Trust that as you serve others selflessly or even secretly, your needs will still be met abundantly, as the divine hand supplies abundantly to the hands that work diligently on his behalf. And this is something that I have personally experienced time and time again when I was working in service to others with nonprofits or doing something that was working towards the betterment of others or communities. I always found that when resources were seemingly short, or when I had a need for, let's say, housing, or when I had a need for money or certain expertise to show up, the right supply, the right people, the right expertise, opportunities were offered. And believe me, in some of these instances, I was running down to the wire, wondering, is it really going to show up this time? But the unshakable belief that it would, the unshakable belief that I am a divine child accepting from a giving, limitless, loving Father, that belief always led to the fruition of the right supply at the right moment. Do you have that unshakable belief? Because if you do, you too will benefit from this infinite generosity. I promise. 2, it requires the surrender of our personal will to divine will. It comes with the faith that alignment with God is alignment with the highest good for all, including yourself. That when you commit yourself to a higher purpose, you are then setting yourself on a trajectory to reveal your absolute potential. And while you do so, harness the gifts of the infinite as you partner with power to bring the reflection of love into this world. 3, humility is using one's authority and influence to uplift the voice, opportunity, and well-being of those around them. A humble warrior understands that true power and influence is a blessing bestowed from above, to be used for the purposes of good and justice, to be used for the purposes of restoring balance, order, and truth into our environment. These 3 principles, when adhered to, diminish the false sense of self. The part of you that says, I am more important, I am more distinguished, or in other words, I am separate from everybody else, I am separate from God. The more you diminish this false sense of self, the more you identify with the grander narrative of your soul's identity as God's very own image and likeness, as it says in Genesis. Now imagine a solar eclipse, where the sun is our soul, the spiritual truth of our being. The moon represents the ego that is blocking out the sun. The ego moves out of the way and the brilliance of your true identity shines through. See, that shine, the brilliance is already there. It's always there. There's just a whole lot of other false idea in the way right now. So as the ego moves out of the way, you reveal your true identity. This concept of self-negation is so important, and it's present in almost every major religion. The word Islam, for example, means to submit or surrender one's will to God's will. And as we do so, we qualify ourselves to be the very representative or caretaker for God on earth. Buddhists have written about extinguishing one's ego and selfish desires as a means to transcend one's own suffering, and from this elevated station, going on to help alleviate the sufferings of others. In Hinduism, one pierces the veil of illusion, of individuality and separation by overcoming the egoic self. In so doing, one merges one's awareness with the one and only divine consciousness, the singular unified field of the Godhead. And in a world where the blind have been leading the blind, the liberated is able to become the liberator of others. In 2 Philippians, Paul drives this point home. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but to the interests of others. In your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. He made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. This, my beloved friends, is what Jesus means when he says on the mount, the meek will inherit the earth. I find it so interesting how those that society initially writes off as weak, outcasts, or lowly often become the very ones who shaped the course of history. The high and haughty being brought low, the humble and meek being raised high is a constant theme that we see in scriptures. I'll give you a few examples here. In Genesis, Joseph was raised from what would have been certain death in the pit and the dungeons to become the prime minister of Egypt. He used his position of leadership to carefully manage resources so that Egypt would successfully weather a severe famine and become the breadbasket to the nations around it. In Exodus, the arrogance of the Pharaoh was countered by the humble leadership of Moses. And the same baby Moses who was sentenced to death at birth went on to be raised within the house of the Pharaoh himself, eventually becoming the liberator of the Hebrew people. And in the Gospels, we see the arrogance of the religious elite. We see the might of Rome, the mocking of the soldiers and the crowds, in contrast to the humble beginnings, the inglorious death, and the ultimate victory of Jesus on the cross by having demonstrated perfect faith, perfect love, and perfect service. One of my favorite scenes in the Gospels demonstrates the true and humble leadership style of Jesus. This emotional scene takes place when Jesus enters Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. You might be familiar with it. He's met with jubilant crowds as they try to declare him king. The people, just like his disciples, expected a savior of Israel to emerge onto a scene as a valiant warrior, a grand king, on a mode of transport befitting a king, perhaps a war horse or a chariot. However, on this occasion, Jesus chose to ride in on a colt, a young donkey. Biblical scholars would say, of course, that this is the fulfillment of a prophecy from 400 years prior in the book of Zechariah. But there's also another significance here. The donkey is a service animal. It's a work animal. If I may use a modern example, it would be like a modern leader riding towards his or her coronation or his or her nomination for presidency, passing over a limousine or a luxury car or a nice sedan, preferring instead to ride into the celebration or occasion on a Ford F-150 pickup truck borrowed from a nearby farm. This mode of transport signifies a new kind of leadership that Jesus is demonstrating. Humble, service-oriented leadership that is stripped of all vanity and superfluousness, yet is practical, effective, and endowed with all the authority of divine power. And at the very height of this celebration of him, Jesus weeps. He weeps for the people he cares so much about because he knows how the rest of the story is going to play out. And he knows what the fate of Jerusalem will be in the years to come. These examples are plentiful and they are worth learning from. In the books of Samuel, and as we saw in part 1 of this warrior series, the prideful Goliath fell quick and hard to a single slingshot by a lowly shepherd boy, delivering bread and cheese to the battlefield. And we saw Saul raised up as the first king of Israel, only to see him fall into madness and death by his own hands after repeatedly going against the divine guidance he was issued in favor of his own self-interested agenda. Saul's crown would pass on to David, who was in his youth employed in the humble role as Saul's personal musician and armor bearer before he was elevated to king. Now that's an ascent to power. Time and again, we see the most unlikely candidates lifted up from humble beginnings to become God's very chosen ones, to remind the rest of us of our true identity, potential, and purpose, and to reinstate balance, justice, and hope back into the world. So if you are someone who is an aspiring leader or leader and you're wondering, but my origins are too humble, or my origins are too bleak, or I'm too at the edges of society to make any kind of difference, we can take hope in these examples, because David's story as well reflects this ascent from obscurity to champion warrior to the very throne of Israel. Early scenes of his life describe him too as an outcast, even to his own family. We get a sense of the painful feeling of rejection that David must have felt when he lamented in Psalm 69, "I am a foreigner to my own family, a stranger to my own mother's children. They put gall in my food and gave me vinegar for my thirst." Now, when Israel's wise leader, judge, and interpreter of God's will, Samuel, was instructed to seek out the next king of Israel, after Saul clearly failed in his mission, he was instructed to do so from one of the sons of Jesse. Now, David, who was one of the sons of Jesse, was not among the sons presented for selection because he was outside. He was made to look after the family's livestock. He was not considered to be a son equal to Jesse's other sons. And yet, David was the one who was chosen of Jesse's 8 sons. Why? Because God sought a man after his own heart. God sought a man after his own heart, and he found that in young David. Notice this. The precondition of elevation is to be one who seeks after God's heart. So again, if you are wondering, if you are in a position where you are thinking, how will I ever make the kind of difference that I would like to make? How can I ever make the kind of impact and change I would like to do or serve in the world with? We too can be one who seeks after God's heart, and this is the precondition for elevation. For God does not select how the rest of man selects. God discerns who he chooses and elevates based on the contents of our heart. Now, David would grow as a warrior who upheld the correct prioritization that I'll summarize from part 1 of this series. 1, he acknowledged God as the source of all power, a God who is willing and able to support us. 2, he acted with integrity, in accordance to the divine laws and its sanctioned parameters. And 3, he acted on worthy purposes that was in alignment with divine will. At a time in history when kings and leaders of nations exalted themselves as living gods on earth, which frankly isn't so different from what we're seeing today, just replace God with any other word, autocrat, authoritarian. These are the new pharaohs, right? David assumed the throne, referring to himself as no more than a servant of God. And as long as a leader holds these statutes with a disposition of humility and service, the hand of God works through that individual. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord like the rivers of water. He turns it wherever he wishes. And Solomon himself was exalted because he too held this prioritization. And this was best captured in a dream sequence following his coronation after the passing of his father David. God appears to Solomon and asks him, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon responds in his dream, "I am only a little child. I do not know how to carry out my duties. Give me wisdom and knowledge that I may lead this people, for who is able to govern this great people of yours?" Through this statement, Solomon exemplifies spiritual humility. 1, he asks for wisdom and knowledge, so he acts in accordance with the highest good for all. And 2, he acknowledges that none of this is possible. His leadership, his throne will not be made secure without God's help. Now God responds to his request favorably because Solomon's heart was in the right place.
Since this is your heart's desire, and you have not asked for wealth, possessions, or honor, nor for the death of your enemies, and since you have not asked for long life, but for wisdom and knowledge to govern my people, wisdom and knowledge will be given to you. And I will also give to you wealth, possessions, and honor, such that no king ever before you ever had, and none after you will have.
And Solomon did enjoy peace and prosperity, unlike any other king of Israel. So imagine how great the rewards are to any leader who applies these principles and foremost seeks after God's heart. Now, I don't like to end videos on a low note, so I'll offer a word of caution first, and then I'm going to follow it up with some hope. As sad as it is worth mentioning that while both kings David and Solomon had an incredible start to their life and leadership, both men ultimately failed to uphold the standard that they initially set forth. The events in their later lives would become a cautionary tale of what not to do, as exemplified by the havoc that stemmed from some of their poor decisions. We'll cover that in a later part of the Warrior series where we address another big topic that is a trap for so many leaders, and that is temptation. You might be wondering, Samier, if these great leaders stumble, then what are my chances of ever succeeding? Many leaders stumble, especially those who abandon the quality of humility on the way to the top. Just turn on the news and at least once a week, there's going to be some controversy affecting a world leader, a politician, a person of influence, or whatever. Take this more as a cautionary tale. Again, we're going to cover more of that in the video on temptation. That said, there are time-tested and specific things we can do to develop humility, and in the process, safeguard our purpose, our mission, and the legacy that we leave behind. I'm going to cover these in the next installment of the Warrior series, so stay tuned for that. Hit the like and subscribe on your way out so you will be alerted when that video drops. Until then, stay humble and may peace be with you.